Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. Today we are taking a look at the best decks to climb in the upcoming season. Now, there was a Duelist Cup that just happened, as well as a ban list that kind of nerfed some things, but I do want to go over the best decks for climbing in the upcoming season. Now, some things did change with the metagame, and have changed with the way that things may look for, with the Duelist Cup being, or having just concluded. So we're going to quickly go over all of these decks here, and if you have any other comments, feel free to leave them down below. If you have a specific deck that isn't on here, and you want me to tell you where it might go. So we have just 5 simple tiers. We got Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Rogue, and then for fun. Now, all of these can get to Master easy. All of these decks can easily get to Master tier. I genuinely believe so. Getting to Master 1 is slightly different. However, if you're good enough, Rogue and above should get to Master 1. Master 1 with Tier 1 is super easy. Tier 2 is fairly easy. You just have to be slightly, you have to be slightly good or have, a bit of determination. Tier 3, you may have to play a bit more games, but you're still going to be able to do it. Rogue is where it starts to become a challenge. Especially in the time frame. So yeah, let's quickly go through each deck, starting off with the Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul did pretty well in the Duelist Cup, and I do think that it is fairly decent right now. However, it does lose to a lot of things that aren't specifically the meta. Not opening Shifter is a big death sentence against something like Snake Eye. You just can't really push through those boards. I know some people may think that, but honestly, even with just pure engine, you're not going to be able to do that. You do really have to rely on some of your non-engine, and there's just not really that many good non-engine right now for Vanquish Soul. I do think that it's pretty good, but yeah, I don't think it's crazy by any stretch of the imagination. Next up, we have Prank Kid. Now, I believe they just got back the Meow Meow Mew to 2 not too long ago, or did it go back to 3? Or is that the TCG? No, I have no idea. Meow Meow Mew, I believe, went back to 3. Yeah, it went back to 3 recently. But the deck does have some major issues. And that's most notably the fact that it's just pretty inconsistent. It loses to a lot of hand traps. It's not really all that insane by any stretch of the imagination. And it has the same issues as, like, better combo decks, like Superheavy Samurai and what have you. So, there's that. Next up, Infernoble. Infernoble is really good right now for climbing. It's just like a very solid deck that wins very easily. If its combo resolves, you win the game. It's that simple. All you have to do is have the combo resolve, which is not too difficult. The only thing that you're really concerned about is, like, Max C and maybe Droll, depending on your hand. Probably Droll. You can play through Nibiru, you can play through Infip, depending on the hand, you can play through each individual hand trap. Is it the best? No, but it's fairly good and fairly decent right now for climbing. Next up, Branded. Branded goes in Tier 2. I know a lot of people are like, oh, Branded is like one of the best decks right now. It's okay. It's fairly decent. I think it's not nearly as good for climbing as it would be for, like, the Duelist Cup or something like that. And I know some people are like, oh, well, wouldn't the Duelist Cup be the same thing as climbing? And to that I say no, because most of the time in the Duelist Cup, you're playing against specifically other meta decks. Either meta or anti-meta specifically. So you're expecting to see a certain type of deck and a certain style of player, right? Whereas in regular ranked, it can be a wide variety of different decks and a wide variety of different styles as well, which makes it so that decks that can kind of cover that big variety by just having like a big combo or something like that is a lot better. And I think Branded kind of can't quite do that. I should say, can't quite do that as efficiently as some of the other decks can. It's still very, very strong, and it still absolutely can. It's just not as strong as some of the other decks that we'll put at the top, starting off with Snake Eye. Yeah, Snake Eye is still the best deck. Even though it didn't necessarily win the Duelist Cup, it did have the most representation, and it is still very, very strong, even with the minor limitation to Kashtira Unicorn. I still think Snake Eye is very, very good in general. Do I think that the Kashtira build in particular is the best version? Maybe. Hard to really say, but yeah, it's definitely still very strong. I have no faith in Earthbound. I really wish Earthbound was better. It's just not. I think this deck is very cool. I think it's a very interesting style, but it's not very good. Spright. Spright is thoroughly slept on. Spright is still a decently good deck, especially for climbing in particular, because similarly to Infernoble, if you do the combo, you do kind of just win the game. But the notable exception to Infernoble is the fact that Spright can play a wide variety of different styles. Spright can be pure Spright, or a more 2-centric Spright. You can play Live Twin, you can play Runick, you can play Tri-Brigade, all of which are very good, and all of which are very strong. Gold Pride is okay, it's not all that great. The main reason that I don't think it's all that great, it just loses to so much. Like, a single hand trap can stop it, and its end board, if it does end up popping off, even with the punk stuff, is still very susceptible to a lot of things, right? And with the wide variety of other decks that are likely to pop up in a ladder climb, it does make it a little bit weaker. It also has to play through, you know, the fact that it has to go second, which it doesn't really do all that effectively, while also playing through hand traps like Max C and Imperm and all of that stuff, which does really hurt the deck. So I don't think it's as bad. Like, if you were to play this in the Duelist Cup, I would probably put it a little bit higher. I think it's a little bit stronger. But again, for climbing, not nearly as strong. Sky Striker can do stuff. Sky Striker, I think a lot of people see it as like a decently good control deck and is like, oh, it's good. It's not. I'm just here to tell you right now it's not. There are so many decks that just do not care at all about anything that this deck does. You genuinely have to work pretty hard to make this deck in particular threatening. I think the Sky Striker cards are absolutely busted. Engage is one of the most busted spells I've ever read, and I despise it. But Sky Striker as a strategy isn't all that great, mostly because everything targets, which is like really easy to deal with right now. But all in all, it's still decent, and it can play Kaiser Coliseum, which is notable. Next up we have Kashtira. I think Kashtira is still fairly decent, and this is more like pure Kashtira, more so than anything, because we've already talked about Snake Eye. But when it comes to pure Kashtira, I don't think this deck is insane, and I think it does struggle, more specifically because if you're not playing against meta decks and Shifter doesn't do anything, or if you can't get to a in a Rice Heart or something like that, or if you're just dumb like most other Master Duel players and you play into Nibiru because you just think Nibiru doesn't exist, you end up just losing. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Just make a Rice Heart. You don't need to make Shangri Era. It's not doing anything. Just make a Rice Heart. It's good enough. Anyway, sorry, there's my little PSA. But even with that being said, I still think the Kashtira stuff just isn't all that great right now, and more specifically on ladder. If it's more of an anti-meta strategy, it's a lot better, but against a wide variety of decks, it's not great. Next up, we have Tearlament. Tearlament is very slept on in general. It's still very, very strong. Yes, only having 2 of the fusions does matter and stuff like that, but having access to Kit Kalos to basically bridge that gap is wildly powerful. It's just a very, very strong strategy and has the ability to just high roll a lot. But notably, it also plays through end boards with Engine, which is very strong. So being able to do that is very, very nice. However, if something gets like called by, which called by, but if something gets called by, it becomes way more problematic. Labrynth is probably the second best deck for climbing, just in general. I think it's very, very strong. I think it does a lot of good. You do have to actually know how to play the deck, but if you do, it is incredibly strong. Or you could also just play Floodgates. That like also works. However, you'd have to put in a lot more games if you did that. Whereas if you actually learned how to play the deck, then you wouldn't. It's that simple. Mathmech I'm going to put into tier 1. I hate this deck, but it is so very good for climbing. Reason being, it does the combo. And it's basically, it's not a skill check. It's literally just, do you have the out? You don't? awesome. I win the game. And it plays through hand traps effortlessly. Which is another benefit that Labrynth has as well, is that it can play through hand traps basically meaninglessly. Right? They just don't do anything. With one exception to Mathmech. Mathmech doesn't have the ability to play through Maxi. That is like the one thing it can't play through. It also, but like it can play through Nibiru with ease. It can play through Valor. It can play through Imperm. It can play through Ash Blossom. I guess it can't play through like Shifter, but what deck can realistically? So I think it's very, very strong for climbing in particular. Mana, on the other hand, just isn't. I would say it has similar pitfalls to something like Superheavy Samurai, but when it comes to climbing, and specifically trying to get to Master 1, mana has a lot more weaknesses. It's more frail to individual hand traps, its individual actions aren't nearly as powerful, it doesn't have a more resilient end board, it's just overall just worse than something like Mathmech or even Superheavy Samurai. And it does actually lose to things like Maxi, Nibiru, and Droll, all of which are very common right now. Red Dragon Archfiend is not great. If we're talking about a pure Red Dragon Archfiend deck, it's just not all that strong. Yes, it does have the ability to do stuff, but that's kind of it. It has like 2 negates, maybe. It has like, that's it. It's just like 2 interactions. So there's a few things that it can do, but not a whole lot. Swordsoul is fairly decent right now. I think Swordsoul is always a decently good option in the metagame. For climbing, it's a very simple and easy deck to play. It doesn't really... like, if your opponent can out your board, they can out your board. But if they can't, you do just win the game. Right? But it's also, like, not a difficult... or not an easy deck to out. And it has the ability to play through end boards with engine, which I think is very, very important in a deck to climb with. So there you go. Rikka is fine. It's decently okay. I don't think it's crazy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is pretty decent. Loses to Maxi, loses to Nibiru, loses to like Imperm, right? A lot of the hands just kind of don't do anything, and while it can have a lot of interactions that work and can, you know, just produce hands that are wild, and Rikka Con is a card that just shouldn't exist. Even with all of that being said, I still think it's too slow, and it just doesn't quite do enough. Its end boards are very beatable, and so, yeah. Destina is tragic. Moving on. Superheavy Samurai I'm also going to put into tier 1. I think it's one of the better combo decks right now, just to climb with. Yeah, it just does its combo, and it does it really well. I'm actually going to put it above Mathmech. Not by much, but it is up there. Yeah. Still kind of loses to Maxi, still loses to Droll, still kind of loses to Nibiru, but not nearly as much. And its end board is King Calamity, which is a stupid card. It's a stupidly good card. We have Rescue Ace, which I think is a very heavily slept on deck. Does it brick? Yes, a little. But it basically does the Snake Eye stuff, but with set 4 pass, which is very strong in a ladder setting. Basically, diversifying where your interactions come from is very, very useful in a situation like this, where you can climb. So there's that. I think it's very strong. There you go. Mikanko is honestly not all that great for climbing. It's okay, it can kind of do stuff, but most people would use it for like the OTK potential, and I don't think that that's all that useful. I think it's you're much better off utilizing it as like a pseudo, not like an OTK, but like kind of a stun deck. But even with that being said, I still don't think that this deck is all that great. And no matter how you play it, I don't know. Yeah, you can OTK. Moving on, Purrely just got back one of Pretty Memory, I believe. This deck is still pretty decent. Even with the limitations to Pretty Memory, it's still a decently good deck and still has a lot of teeth. So there's that. It does require you to kind of play more bricks and stuff like that and have a few more dead hands, which does matter, but its end boards, like, no one is currently prepared for a big noir, so, you know, there's that. I guess the biggest issue is that it loses to, like, Droll and multiple hand traps and stuff like that, but I guess what deck doesn't, you know? Next up we have Runick. Now, I would imagine this is on here as, like, Runick Spright. Or, not Runick Spright, but Runick Stun. And if we're talking about Stun, which I currently don't have on here, I don't think Stun's all that great for climbing. I think it's just people play it because they're like, oh, this deck did really well in the Duelist Cup. And it's like, well, that's because it was specifically playing against meta decks, and it is specifically countering meta decks. If you're doing that, and you're expecting to see just a whole bunch of meta decks, then sure. But if you're expecting to see, like, these tier just as much as these tier, then, like, you're gonna have a bad time. However, if we're talking about Runick in the way that most players should be playing Runick, with, like, Runick Spright, or Runick Furhire, or any of those other fun, interesting Runick decks, this deck is very powerful. Runick is still very strong as an engine, and is still very good for climbing. It's as simple as that. You basically utilize the Runick spells as hand traps, which is very nice. It can push through boards pretty easily because of those cards, because not a lot of decks are prepared for spell traps right now, right? Minus, like, maybe these two. This one definitely. Maybe this one a little. But, yeah. Runick is still very strong. Flunder is just too inconsistent. It would be a lot higher if it was more consistent. It's as simple as that. And TG technically has the ability to play the game through the Snake Eye stuff. So if we're talking about, like, Snake Eye TG, sure, it's, like, pretty high up here because it's just, like, a worse TG. But if we're talking about actual TG, which is not centered on the Snake Eye stuff, it's not good. Like, an Imperm kills it. But there you go. Anyway, one thing of note that is not on here, that I will talk about, is Tri-Brigade. Tri-Brigade is a very good deck that is also pretty heavily slept on. I'd probably put it above Purrely right now. I think Tri-Brigade is very strong, especially with the Spright stuff in particular. But just in general, I'd probably put it like there. Tri-Brigade's still very strong. There were, what, 3 duelists who were playing Tri-Brigade in some capacity, whether Tri-Brigade Spright or a Leaderless Tri-Brigade, and or I should say that got top 100. So there you go. It's still definitely playable. And honestly, this metagame is a lot more diverse, and you can kind of just pick a whole lot of different decks if you want to. And it's not determined by one deck, as a lot of people may have anticipated. Konami has actually done pretty well with a lot of the more recent releases of top-tier meta threats. You know, when we got Kashtira, it was, you know, fairly common, but it wasn't insane. Same with Snake Eye, you know, same with Superheavy Samurai. A lot of people panicked about those decks, and they're definitely more powerful in the TCG, but not in Master Duel. Anyway, that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy, and if you did, a like is very much so appreciated. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.